Okay, this week we'd like to discuss strawmanning and steelmanning. These are two techniques that have to do with how you talk about your policy proposal with other people. So let's plunge in. Okay, I want to say right off the bat that one of these is an example of a bad technique that you should strive to avoid, and the other is an example of a good technique that you should strive to use, at least if you wish to engage in good discourse. So as not to keep you in suspense, I'm giving it away right here. Strawmanning is the bad technique and steelmanning is the good technique. So let's talk about these. First, let's begin with strawmanning. You've probably heard of someone accusing another person of attacking a straw man. Hopefully nobody has ever accused you of doing it, but in any case, strawmanning is a form of argumentation, but it's not a very good form. We say that someone is attacking a straw man when, instead of addressing and refuting their opponent's actual policy position, they offer up some inaccurate or weaker version of their opponent's actual position and then attack or refute that instead of the real position. The term comes from back when people used to simulate combat against a literal straw dummy, and it might have made you feel good to defeat that, but it's not the real thing, so it's not fair. And sometimes this is an intentional strategy to attack a straw man, and sometimes it's unintentional. Usually it's intentional, though. Let's look at some fictional examples, and I think you'll agree that they're not all that fictional. Strawmanning happens every day, particularly in politics and policymaking. And just to be extra cautious about being fair, the examples we'll go over today will be given from both political angles, so I don't want to suggest for a moment that one party does this more than another. Certainly policymakers from both major parties give straw man arguments all the time. Okay, so the first example. Imagine a Senator A and a Senator B, okay? So Senator A gives a speech to Congress. She argues that the federal government should not expand subsidies on the health insurance exchanges because it cannot afford to do so given current budgetary constraints. She argues that instead of expanding subsidies to enable people to purchase expensive coverage, we should instead examine why health insurance is so expensive in the first place and focus our efforts on making insurance cheaper. Okay, so that's her part of the argument. Senator B gets up and gives an impassioned reply to that speech, and in essence what he says is he's shocked and appalled that Senator A wants to deny uninsured Americans their only hope of getting coverage and let them die in the street. Let's imagine that that's a direct quote from Senator B. Okay, so who is attacking a straw man here? It's Senator B. And why is this a straw man argument? Well, Senator B is guilty of attacking a straw man because not expanding a subsidy and denying coverage are two very different things. If you take someone who isn't currently getting a subsidy, let's say because he or she is over a certain income threshold and thus doesn't qualify under the current rules, and let's say you take that person and then you choose to continue that policy of not giving that person a subsidy, that's not exactly the same thing as denying them coverage. The same options that were open to that person before are still open to them. Now, they might not be very good options, and it may absolutely be the case that that person needs help and is worthy of help in all sorts of ways. But to call that, quote, denying coverage, it's not a fair characterization of Senator A's actual position, which is about budget priorities and seeking ways to reduce the high price of insurance in a more root cause kind of way. Quote, denying coverage would be an accurate term for, let's say, when you approach an insurance company and you seek to buy an insurance policy, but for some reason, perhaps in a pre-existing condition, let's say, they literally refuse to sell you a policy. That's actually denying coverage. So this whole thing from Senator B is a straw man. And of course, if that wasn't enough, Senator B also kind of throws in the invective there that Senator A wants to let people die in the street. And that level of hyperbole is usually a pretty good indicator that there's a straw man argument happening. So now let's give the same or talk about the same example, but from the other side of the issue. So imagine that Senator B now gives a speech to Congress, and he argues that the federal government should expand subsidies on the health insurance exchanges because getting more people covered with access specifically to preventative care will give people much needed coverage, and it might even save money in the long run. Okay, so that's Senator B's part. And then imagine Senator A gets up and gives an impassioned reply to that speech. She says that she's, quote, dumbfounded and flabbergasted that with the government's shaky record on healthcare, Senator A wants big government to seize control of the nation's healthcare system and pay for everyone's healthcare, end quote. Okay, so who in this scenario is attacking a straw man? It's Senator A in response to Senator B. Now, why is this a straw man argument? Senator A is guilty of attacking a straw man here because Senator B isn't proposing a government takeover of all health insurance. All Senator B is proposing is an expansion of an existing program of subsidization. For all we know, it could be a very modest expansion. And Senator B has even proposed that the expansion could, in theory, maybe even pay for itself. For instance, if the prevention component pans out and it really does keep people healthier. Now, the latter part of that might or might not be true. And in fact, the evidence can be mixed when it comes to those sorts of justifications. But either way, it's unfair for Senator A to characterize Senator B's proposal as a, quote, takeover. Senator B, for instance, said nothing about doing away with private insurance companies or instituting a more drastic reform. So one thing about these two examples that we've seen, an important thing to clarify is that it's not strawmanning just to disagree with the person's proposal or even to judge it harshly. So, if you think your opponent's proposal is, let's say, risky, and you call it risky, that's fair. Or if you think it might lead to or cause some other undesirable consequence down the road, it's even fair to raise that possibility, but you have to take ownership of making that connection. You can't present it as if your opponent somehow wants that undesirable future thing to happen. You have to take ownership of that. What makes something a straw man argument is not merely that you give something a negative evaluation. It's that you're literally evaluating the wrong thing, something that he or she didn't say. If you evaluate your opponent's actual position, you're being fair. You're not straw manning. But if you misrepresent or present a caricature of your opponent's position just so that you can more easily attack it, then you're in straw man territory. Why do people set up straw man and attack straw man? Generally, there are two reasons why. First, they don't understand their opponent's real position, and so instead of doing the actual hard work of thinking about it and really figuring out what the other person is really proposing, they just decide to ridicule it. Or number two, they do understand their opponent's real position, but they sort of secretly fear that it is better than their own position and that they would lose if it were a fair debate. And so that they, in that case, they try to make it unfair. Under neither scenario, at least to any intelligent onlooker, do you come out looking good if you strawman. So I would say that if you care about your sort of reputation and your integrity in this sense, don't engage in straw manning. Okay, so that's enough about straw manning. On to steel manning. And in case you haven't figured it out, steel manning is the opposite of straw manning, and it is the technique that you want to use, at least if your intention is to engage in good discourse. Steel manning is addressing and refuting not just your opponent's actual position, but going above and beyond that, really, and addressing and refuting the best possible version of their actual position. And if you do it well, then it's really great. It leaves almost no doubt that your position or proposal is better. So why is it called steel manning? Obviously, it's a play off of the term straw man, which has been around a lot longer. The idea is basically that you are holding up instead of holding up a flimsy version of somebody else's argument and then just knocking it down the way you could if it were made of straw. The idea is that you're putting up the strongest, toughest, most robust version of the other person's argument as if it were made of steel. And then if your argument is good enough to beat that, then perhaps you are onto something. You really can say that you have the better case or the better idea. So the basic idea of Steelmanning has gone by a few names over the years. For instance, in debate, in competitive debate, there's something called the principle of charity. And the principle of charity says that one should take the strongest possible understanding of the opponent's position, because only if you defeat the strongest possible version of your opponent's argument can you say that you've really robustly defeated them. That's a little bit of a competitive perspective on it, but we'll see in a minute how Steelmanning is really good at also building trust and building rapport, which is perhaps more useful in the policy world. So Steelmanning has recently been made kind of famous by a few different people, but most notably, there's a philosopher by the name of Daniel Dennett. He's a contemporary American philosopher, and in one of his books recently, he describes the Steelmanning approach. And he actually refers to it as Rappaport's rules, after a game theorist named Anatole Rappaport, but it's really become pretty widely known as Steelmanning, so that's what we're calling it here. And here are Dennett's rules on Steelmanning. Rule number one, or I guess step number one, is you should attempt to re-express your target's position so clearly, vividly, and fairly that your target says, thanks, I actually wish I'd thought of putting it that way myself. Number two, or step two, you should list any points of agreement, especially if they are not matters of general or widespread agreement. So not the trivial stuff, but list and mention in your discussion what things you actually do agree on, so that you have some sort of common ground to build on. Number three, you should mention anything that you have learned from your target. Just sort of a charitable notion of mentioning what you have gained and what you've added to your position, thanking your target. And then step four, only then are you permitted to say so much as a word of rebuttal or criticism. So those are the sort of four steps to Steelmanning. Essentially, Steelmanning is a check on your own intellectual honesty. Dennett has put it the following way. He said, quote, "It's the best antidote for the tendency to caricature one's opponent." Okay, now you're probably eager to see this in action, so let's return to the two examples that we started with regarding the health insurance subsidy. And remember, Senator A is the one who doesn't want to expand subsidies, and Senator B is the one who does want to expand subsidies. So let's say if Senator A were to use Steelmanning, the discourse might sound more like this. Senator B has proposed to expand subsidies on the health insurance exchanges. He's understandably concerned about the challenges that uninsured individuals face in seeking care in this country. It's neither easy nor cheap to go and purchase coverage, especially if you don't have the option to get it through your employer. There are many cracks and inefficiencies in the current system. We've learned from advocates of expanded coverage that uninsured people are more likely to end up in the emergency room, which is expensive and possibly even more expensive than the cost of expanding the subsidies in the first place. But still, even recognizing all that, we need to be careful in how we approach the problem of bringing down the cost of expensive coverage. It would be better in the long run and more fiscally responsible to examine why health insurance has become so expensive in the first place. For instance, we have a third-party payer system that provides no incentive for people to control costs. And we have coverage mandates that make people buy insurance for things that they don't even want to be covered for. Our focus should be on enacting changes that allow the price of coverage to fall where it should be, so that individuals can afford it on their own. We don't need to rely on the government for help. So that's an example of something maybe that Senator A would say if Senator A were Steelmanning. To see what Senator A did there, she acknowledged the other person's actual position, she built up some trust, acknowledged what she's learned from the other side, brought in the piece about the savings, maybe even offsetting the cost of expansion, which perhaps Senator B might not have even thought of or presented. And then only then did she turn to her rebuttal and her alternative proposal. Now, I tried to do this as concisely as possible for the sake of the video, but one thing about Steelmanning is that it's hard to do in just a couple of sentences. It takes usually paragraphs of writing or several minutes of speaking. I've seen this done by speakers on a stage, right there in front of each other, and it can take, it might take 3 to 5 minutes of speaking time from each person in order to do this well, at least. Okay, so I hope that's starting to be clear, but of course, just for completeness, let's Steelman the other side too, and then after that, we'll wrap up. So in our little example, remember Senator B is the one who is for expanding subsidies, so here's what it might sound like if he were to use Steelmanning. He might say the following: Senator A believes that we should not expand subsidies on the health insurance exchanges. She has some good reasons for this position. For example, she argues that in our current situation with the federal budget, we cannot afford this expenditure. She's concerned that it costs too much and that we have too many other competing priorities at the moment. And that's fair. No matter how much we would like to make health insurance more affordable to people especially in that gray area between needing assistance and not needing assistance, we have to remember that every dollar we spend on this is a dollar that we cannot spend in other areas, including education or infrastructure or other entitlements. We might even worry that with increased subsidization, we take away the insurance company's incentive to be competitive on price. But even in this context, health must be the priority, because without the personal security of health, of what use are these other things? Health is the thing on which all other things depend. My proposal increases the cost of the subsidy by only 3%, and in my proposal, I've identified 2 other areas within healthcare where we cut waste, enabling this expansion to, in effect, pay for itself. So there's an example of Senator B perhaps doing some effective Steelmanning. Just as the other senator did, he acknowledged the other person's actual position, built up some trust, brought in the piece about insurance companies not having an incentive to be price competitive, which maybe Senator A hadn't even thought of but could have used. And then only after that did he start to make a rebuttal. And I kept the rebuttal really short here, but that would be the jumping off point where he could go on and say more. So very briefly, why is Steelmanning better? It's better because it builds respect and trust and rapport among the people in the discussion. Because part of the strategy is to acknowledge the valid parts of each other's position. It actually advances the discussion. And people can't just dig themselves into a position and then just kind of repeat themselves if they embrace Steelmanning. They can't do that. And the other thing is that even if you win, then it's possible that you can win over some of the other people. Normally, if you defeat another party in some sort of policy debate, you're not going to win them over. You're not going to make them very happy, especially if you strawman them. They'll know that they've been ridiculed and misrepresented. They're not going to want to help you out in any way. But if you steelman, it's possible that you win them over. You won't anger them because they will be aware of the fact that you haven't won by some sort of cheap trick. You won in a more robust way. And the other reason why it's better is because steelmanning is a reality-oriented process. So you might lose, but even if you do lose, what that really means is that you found out something really important. So if you were really fair and really accurate, then what it probably means if you lost is that you found out that maybe your proposal actually doesn't stand up to scrutiny. And that's an important thing to be open to and to recognize and to be willing to recognize. So that's strawmanning and steelmanning. I hope you found this interesting and useful, and I hope to continue this discussion in class with some of your own examples. Thank you very much.